Continuing Isaac Luria and his school in Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism by Gershom G. Scholem. Luria was no less a scholar than many other Kabbalists during his formative years in Egypt. He had his fill of rabbinical learning, but although he speaks the symbolical language of the old Kabbalists, particularly that of the anthropomorphists among them, it is evident that he is looking for ways of expressing new and original thoughts. Unlike Cordovero, he left no written legacy when he passed away in 1572 at the age of 38. Indeed, he seems to have lacked the literary faculty altogether. When one of his disciples, who seemed to have worshipped him like a superior being, asked him once why he did not set out his ideas and teachings in book form, he is said to have replied, "It is impossible because all things are interrelated. I can hardly open my mouth to speak without feeling as though the sea burst its dams and overflowed. How then shall I express what my soul has received, and how can I put it down in a book?" Actually, a critical analysis of the very numerous written tracts which circulate under his name, and which the Kabbalists always reverently referred as Kethe Ha'ari, the writings of the Sacred Lion, shows that either before or during his stay in Safed, which lasted only about 3 years, Luria did make an attempt to put his thoughts down in a book, which is undoubtedly authentic and in our possession. This is his commentary to the Sephirah de Tsenuet. I'm not sure how that's supposed to be pronounced. It would be nice to have the letterings for some of this, but Sephirah de Tsenuet? I don't know. The Book of Concealment, one of the most difficult parts of the Zohar. But here we find little that is peculiar to him. In addition, a number of his commentaries on certain passages of the Zohar have survived. Finally, there are his 3 mystical hymns for the Sabbath meals, which are among the most remarkable products of Kabbalistic poetry and may be found in almost every prayer book of Eastern Jewry. On the other hand, all we happen to know of his system is based on conversations with his disciples, conversations which were as diffuse and unsystematic as possible. Luckily for us, his pupils have left us several compilations of his ideas and sayings, including some which were written independently of each other, so that we are not, as has sometimes been said, dependent upon a single source. His most important follower, Hayim Vital, 1543 to 1620, is the author of several versions of Luria's system, the most elaborate of which runs into 5 folio volumes, the so-called 8 gates, Shemona, Shirim, into which he has divided his life work. Etz Hayim, the Tree of Life. In addition, we have several anonymous writings, also by his followers, as well as a more compact presentation of the theosophical side of his system by Rabbi Joseph Ibn Tabul, the most authoritative of his disciples after Vital. Tabul's book in manuscript was, for a long time, buried in various libraries with nobody paying any attention to it, and even when it was finally published by pure accident in 1921, it was attributed to the more famous Vital, ironically enough, since Vital seems to have had little sympathy for his rival. What is common to both versions may be safely regarded as the authentic Lurianic doctrine. As regards Luria's personality, it is fortunate that Vital has carefully jointed down hundreds of little personal traits which bear the unmistakable imprint of authenticity. Altogether, Luria's personality comes out much clearer than that of Cordovero, although not long after his death he had already become a legendary figure. There remains enough genuine biographical material to show us the man. First and foremost, he was a visionary. As a matter of fact, we owe to him a good deal of insight into the strength and limits of visionary thinking. The labyrinth of the hidden world of mysticism, for that is the way it appears in the writings of his disciples, was as familiar to him as the streets of Safed. He himself dwelt perpetually in this most mysterious world, and his visionary gaze caught glimpses of cycle life in all that surrounded him. He did not differentiate between organic and inorganic life, but insisted the souls were present everywhere and that intercourse with them was possible. He had many uncanny visions, as for example, when he frequently pointed out to his disciples, while walking with them in the vicinity of Sabbath, the graves of pious men of old, with whose souls he held intercourse. Since the world of the Zohar was to him completely real, he has not infrequently discovered the tombs of men, who were nothing but literary phantoms, derived from the romantic trappings of that remarkable book. Vital's account of his master's critical remarks on earlier Kabbalistic literature is also interesting. He warns against all Kabbalists between Nachmanides and himself, because the prophet Elijah had not appeared to them, and their writings were based purely on human perceptions and intelligence, and not on true Kabbalah. But the books he recommends, such as the Zohar, the commentary of the so-called pseudo-Abraham ben David, to the Book of Creation, the Book Berith, Menuha, and the Book Kana, were without exception written during the period which he condemns. Moreover, Luria, who rejected the lyrical poetry of the medieval poets, had a very high regard for the hymns of Eliezer Kalir, and spoke of them as being representative of the true spirit of mysticism, doubtless because, in accordance with an ancient tradition, he believed this poet to be one of the great teachers of the period of the Mishnah, the period which he also unsophisticatedly believed to be the background of the heroic figures which make their appearance in the great Kabbalist pseudo-epigrapha. By inclination and habit of mind, Luria was decidedly conservative. This tendency is well expressed in his persistent attempts to relate what he had to say to older authorities, especially to the Zohar, and in his attitude towards minor matters. He was always in favor of retaining what had a clearly defined character of his own, and ever ready to grant the mystical truth of contradictory assertions. Even the various types of the Hebrew script have, according to him, each its own mystical significance. In the same way, he accorded equal rights, so to speak, to the different orders of prayer established by the various Jewish communities on the ground that which corresponded to a certain form of prayer, and since no one knew which tribe to which he belonged, there was no harm in being faithful to the traditions and usages of one particular geographical group. The Spanish Jews remaining loyal to their customs, the Jews of Poland to theirs, and so on. The story of the gradual spread of Lurianic Kabbalism is remarkable, and like the creation of the Zohar, not without its dramatic side, Luria's original disciples did comparatively little to spread his ideas, although Hayam Vital began to systematize Luria's thought immediately after his master's death. He was jealously on guard against any attempt by others to claim possession of the key to the mystery. For a time he gave lectures before his former co-disciples on the new doctrines, whose theosophic principles he surrounded with a great deal of scholastic detail. We still have the text of a document from the year 1575, in which almost all the more important pupils of Luria, insofar as they were still living in Sabbath, undertook in writing to recognize Vital's authority as supreme. We shall study the Kabbalah with him and truly remember all he tells us, and relate to no one else anything of the mysteries which we shall learn from him, or which he has taught us in the past, even of what he has taught us in the lifetime of our teacher, the great Rabbi Isaac Luria Ashkenazi, except it be that we receive his permission. Subsequently, Vital withdrew completely from this activity, and only very reluctantly admitted others to the knowledge of his Kabbalistic writings until his death in Damascus in 1620 of the Common Era. Not a single one of his books was reproduced and circulated with his permission. A large number of them were, however, secretly copied in Sabbath in 1587, while he was dangerously ill, his brother having received a bribe of 50 pieces of gold for handing them over, and therefore circulated among the adepts in Palestine. Nor can it be said of Joseph ibn Tabul, Luria's second most important follower, that he was a zealous propagandist, although he seems to have been somewhat more active in teaching his master's doctrine in Sabbath itself. He was not among those who signed the above-mentioned declaration, and it is known that he also taught pupils who had not studied under Luria. On the whole, the spread of Lurianic Kabbalism was almost entirely due to the activity of another Kabbalist, Israel Sarug, who, between 1592 and 1598, carried on a lively propaganda in the interests of the new school among the Kabbalists of Italy. He posed as one of Luria's principal disciples, although it seems certain that he had no claim to this title and that all his knowledge of Lurianic doctrine was derived from those stolen copies of Vital's writings which had come into his hands in Safed. A man of considerable intellectual originality, he conceived himself to have penetrated more deeply than Luria's genuine pupils into the mysteries of the new doctrine. The fact probably explains why his missionary zeal led him to claim an authority which, strictly speaking, he did not possess. The deception passed unnoticed, and down to our own days, Sarug has been treated both by adherents and opponents of Kabbalism as an authentic interpreter of Luria. The truth is that in certain essential points, he gave an entirely new turn to Luria's thought and enriched it by speculative ideas in his own, which I cannot deal with in this context. They are to be found chiefly in the book Limud Etzaluth, Doctrines on Emanation. The essence of Sarug's interpretation of Luria may be described as an attempt to provide a quasi-philosophical basis for Luria's distinctly unphilosophical doctrine by injecting a species of Platonism into it. And the singular success his interpretation achieved was due in part to those elements of its teaching which were not genuinely Lurianic. One of Sarug's own followers subsequently carried these tendencies to a particularly radical conclusion and produced a system of Kabbalism which represents a curious eclectical mixture of the Neoplatonism fashionable in the Italy of the Renaissance and Luria's doctrine, according to the interpretation of Sarug. He was Abraham Cohen Herrera of Florence, died in Amsterdam in 1635 or 1639, the descendant of a Maranic family and the only Kabbalist who wrote in Spanish. His books were translated from Spanish, in which they have been preserved only in manuscript form, into Hebrew and a Latin compendium, which appeared in 1677 of the Common Era, played a very considerable role, not least because it was written in a more or less comprehensible style, in molding the prevailing Christian view of the character of Kabbalism and its alleged pantheism or Spinozism, down to the beginning of the 19th century of the Common Era. While the authentic writings of Luria's Eastern followers achieved a wide circulation already in the 17th century, but almost without exception only in the form of manuscripts, the type of Lurianic Kabbalism represented by the followers of Sarug, specifically in Italy, Holland, Germany, and Poland, predominates in the small number of printed books devoted to the propagation of Luria's ideas before the outbreak of the Sabbatean movement, 1665. Of special importance in this connection was the great folio volume of Naphtali ben Jacob Bacharach of Frankfurt on Main, which appeared in 1648 under the title Emek ha-Melech. A correct translation of this title might be The Mystical Depths of the King rather than The Valley of the King. The book relies wholly on Sarug's interpretation of Luria. It was sharply criticized in parts by Kabbalists, among others, but it was not before the end of the 18th century, the Common Era, and in some respects only in the 19th, that the Kabbalists consented to the publication of Vital's own books in print. However, the innovation did not add much to their popularity, for during the 18th century, the business of copying his writings from manuscripts had become, in some places, like Jerusalem, Italy, and southern Germany, almost an industry. 3. In the years following his death, Luria's mystical inspiration was generally recognized in Safed, and precisely those ideas which were peculiar to him became the common property of later Kabbalism, not at once, but through a process of expansion and development which began shortly before 1600. I have spoken of Luria's mystical inspiration, but it must not be assumed that his doctrine came entirely out of the blue. It is true that at first it strikes one as being entirely different in its outlook and its basic conceptions from the earliest doctrine of the Sabbath school, and especially from Cordovero's system. However, closer comparison makes it apparent that a good many points in Luria's system are based in Cordovero's ideas, although they are developed in such an original way as to lead Luria to quite different and novel conclusions. There is hardly any difference between Cordovero and Luria as far as the practical application of Kabbalistic thought is concerned, although some modern writers have been at pains to prove that this is the real point at issue. Nothing could be further from the truth. It is entirely wrong to say that Cordovero stands for the theory and Luria for the practice of Kabbalism, or alternatively, that Cordovero is the heir of Spanish Kabbalism, while Luria, an Ashkenazic Jew, whose parents appear to have come to Jerusalem only a short time before he was born, represents the consummation of the tradition of Jewish asceticism in medieval Germany. Luria's Kabbalah is just as much, or as little practical, as that of the other Sapphic mystics. They all have something to do with practical Kabbalism, and the things it connotes to the Kabbalistic mind, to which I have drawn attention in the 4th lecture, but all of them were equally anxious to draw a distinction between the practical mysticism and its possible degeneration into magic. And I don't like this mention of the word magic. It's like some sort of slur or something. Why can't it just mean the art and science of spirituality? Are the willful changes in consciousness or otherwise. As for the ascetic ways of life, which Lurianic Kabbalism propagated, it is difficult to find here anything that owes its influence to Luria. On the whole, they are no more than a reflex of religious life in Sapphic as it existed before Luria's time as well as after him. It is to be hoped that the unfortunate term practical Kabbalism as a description of Luria's system, which is already fitting its way into our historical textbooks, will be given its quietus. The hegemony of the Sapphic school, and more especially of its most important offshoot, the Lurianic Kabbalah, may justly be described as a period in which practical mysticism dominated. But for the specific difference between the Lurianic doctrine and its immediate predecessors, we must look elsewhere. To repeat, Luria's ideas are developed by him out of his predecessors, including not only Cordovero, but far older authors. In the case of certain important details for which he went back to the old Kabbalists, it can be said that these played no conspicuous part in their writings, while to Luria they were all important. These connections between Luria and a few half-forgotten Spanish Kabbalists still await an adequate historical analysis. Part 4. We shall see later on the form in which Luria presented his ideas is strongly reminiscent of the Gnostic myths of antiquity. The similarity is, of course, unintentional. The fact is simply that the structure of his thoughts closely resembles that of the Gnostics. His cosmogony is intensely dramatic, and I am inclined to believe that this quality, which was lacking in Cordovero's system, partly explains its success. Compared to that of the Zohar, whose authentic interpretation on the basis of Elijah's revelations it purports to be, his cosmogony is both more original and more elaborate. The older Kabbalists had a much simpler conception of the cosmological processes. According to them, it begins with an act in which God projects his creative power out of his own self into space. Every new act is a further stage in the process of externalization, which unfolds in accordance with the emanationist doctrine of Neoplatonism in a straight line from above downward. The whole process is strictly one way and correspondingly simple. Luria's theory has nothing of this inoffensive simplicity. It is based upon the doctrine of Simsum, one of the most amazing and far-reaching conceptions ever put forward in the whole history of Kabbalism. Simsum originally means concentration, or contraction, but if used in Kabbalistic parlance, it is best translated by withdrawal or retreat. The first idea occurs in a brief and entirely forgotten treatise, which was written in the middle of the 13th century, and of which Luria seems to have made use, while its literary original is a Talmudic saying which Luria inverted. He stood it on its head, no doubt, believing that he had put it on its feet. The Midrash in sayings originating from the 3rd century teachers occasionally refers to God as having concentrated his Shekinah, his divine presence, in the holiest of holies, at the place of the cherubim, as he thought his whole power were concentrated and contracted in a single point. Here we have the origin of the term Simsum, while the thing itself is the practice of this idea. To the Kabbalist of Luria school, Simsum was not meant as a concentration of God at a point, but his retreat away from a point. What does this mean? It means, briefly, that the existence of the universe is made possible by a process of shrinking in God. Luria begins by putting a question which gives the appearance of being naturalistic, and, if you like, somewhat crude. How can there be a world if God is everywhere? If God is all in all, how can there be things which are not God? Well, maybe the second, but not the first would necessitate that, right? How can God create the world out of nothing if there is no nothing? This is the question. The solution became, in spite of the crude form which he gave it, of the highest importance in the history of later Kabbalistic thought. According to Luria, God was compelled to make room for the world by, as it were, abandoning a region within himself, a kind of mystical primordial space from which he withdrew in order to return to it in the act of creation and revelation. The first act of Ein Sof, the infinite being, is therefore not a step outside, but a step inside, a movement of recoil, a falling back upon oneself, of withdrawing into oneself. Instead of emanation, we have the opposite, contraction. The God who revealed himself in firm contours was superseded by one who descended deeper into the recesses of his own being, who concentrated himself into himself, and had done so from the very beginning of creation. To be sure, this view was often felt, even by those who gave it a theoretical formulation, to verge on the blasphemous. Yet it cropped up again and again, modified only ostensibly by a feeble, as it were, or so to speak. One is tempted to interpret this withdrawal of God into his own being in terms of exile, banishing himself from his totality into profound seclusion. Regarded this way, the idea of Simsum is the deepest symbol of exile that could be thought of, even deeper than the breaking of the vessels. In the breaking of the vessels, with which I propose to deal later, something of the divine being is exiled out of himself, whereas the Simsum could come to be considered as an exile unto himself. The first act of all is not an act of revelation, but one of limitation. Only in the second act does God send out a ray of his light, and begin his revelation, or rather his unfolding, as God the Creator, in the primordial space of his own creation. More than that, every new act of emanation and manifestation is preceded by one of concentration and retraction. One of the things that we see mythologically is a breaking of vessels rituals. And some of these things are ancient and we kind of don't know, but could some of it line up with this? In other words, the cosmic process becomes twofold. Every stage involves a nipple strain, i.e. the light, which streams back into God, and that which flows out from him. and but for this perpetual tension, this ever-repeated effort with which God holds himself back, nothing in the world would exist. This is fascinating power and profundity in this doctrine. This paradox of Simsum, as Jacob Emden said, is the only serious attempt ever made to give substance to the idea of creation out of nothing. Incidentally, the fact that an idea which at first sight appears so reasonable as creation out of nothing should turn out, upon inspection, to lead to a theosophical mystery shows us how illusory the apparent simplicity of religious fundamentals really is. Apart from its intrinsic importance, the theory of Simsum also acted as a counterpoise to the pantheism which some scholars think is implied by the theory of emanation. Not only is there residue of a divine manifestation in every being, but under the aspect of Simsum, it also acquires a reality of its own, which guards it against the danger of dissolution into the non-individual being of the divine all-in-all. Luria himself was the living example of an outspoken theistic mystic. He gave the Zohar, for all its intrinsic pantheism, a strict theistic interpretation. Nothing is more natural, therefore, than that the pantheistic tendencies which began to gain momentum in Kabbalism, especially from the period of the European Renaissance onwards, clashed with the Lurianic doctrine of Simsum, and that attempts were made to reinterpret it in such a way as to strip it of its meaning. The question whether it should be interpreted literally or metaphorically came sometimes to be symbolical of the struggle between theistic and pantheistic trends, so much that in later Kabbalism, the position which a writer occupied in the struggle is to a certain extent implied by his stand on the question of Simsum, for if Simsum is merely a metaphor to which no real act or occurrence, however shrouded in mysterious, corresponds, then the question how something that is not God can really exist remains unsolved. If the Simsum, as some later Kabbalists have tried to prove, is only a veil which separates the individual consciousness from God in such a way as to give it the illusion of self-consciousness, in which it knows itself to be different from God, then only an imperceptible change is needed so that the heart may perceive the unity of divine substance in all that exists. Such a change would necessarily destroy the conception of Simsum as one intended to provide an explanation for the existence of something other than God. As I have already said, the doctrine of Simsum played an extremely important part in the development of Lurianic thought, and new attempts to formulate it were made continuously. The history of the idea from Luria down to our own days would give a fascinating picture of the development of original Jewish mystical thought. Here I must content myself with stressing one more aspect which Luria himself undoubtedly regarded as highly important, and for which our source is an authentic remark by himself. According to this, the essence of the divine being before the Simsum took place contained not only the qualities of love and mercy, but also that a divine sternness, which the Kabbalists call Din, or judgment. But Din was not recognizable as such. It was, as it were, dissolved in the great ocean of God's compassion, like a grain of salt in the sea, to use Joseph ibn Tabul's simile. In the act of Simsum, however, it crystallized and became clearly defined, for inasmuch as Simsum signifies an act of negation and limitation, it is also an act of judgment. It must be remembered that to the Kabbalist, judgment means the imposition of limits and the correct determination of things. According to Cordovero, the quality of judgment is inherent in everything insofar as everything wishes to remain what it is, to stay within its boundaries. Hence, it is precisely in the existence of individual things that the mystical category of judgment plays an important part. If, therefore, the Midrash says that originally the world was to have been based on the quality of strict judgment, Din, but God, seeing that this was insufficient to guarantee its existence, added the quality of mercy. The Kabbalist who follows Luria interprets this saying as follows: the first act The act of Simsum, in which God determines and therefore limits himself, is an act of Deen which reveals the roots of this quality in all that exists. These roots of divine judgment subsist in chaotic mixture with the residue of divine light, which remained after the original retreat or withdrawal within the primary space of God's creation. Then a second ray of light out of the essence of Ein Sof brings order into chaos and sets the cosmic process in motion by separating the hidden elements and molding them into a new form. Throughout this process, the two tendencies of perpetual ebb and flow, the Kabbalists speak of Hith Pashtuth, aggression, and His Takuth, regression, continue to act and react upon each other, just as the human organism exists through the double process of inhaling and exhaling, and the one cannot be conceived without the other, so also the whole of creation constitutes a gigantic process of divine inhalation and exhalation. Inhalation and exhalation. In the final resort, therefore, the root of all evil is already latent in the act of Simsum. And these rays of light, we can think of them as the letters of the alphabet forming the pathways on the tree, can't we?